Industrial scrap at the scrapyards, broken home appliances, cars that might or might not be older than maybe 20 years. But can we find the artifacts of a bygone era, the age of iron and coal? Well, if you want to find out, follow me along on another trip through the scrapyards looking for the treasures of yesterday. Two gigantic steel shafts, both splined and with a gear on them, and I'd like to see the machine tools that were used to make these things. And could it be that they're coming from a machine like this over at the Hambach mine? It's only about maybe 30 or 40 kilometers from here. But who knows? In any case, it's a little too heavy for what I had in mind for the video today. Some old chain car, and this looks like a DIY. Someone probably built this for their kids a long time ago. But also not exactly what I'm looking for. And what do we have here? An old Bosch brand angle grinder, and it's a blue one. It's from the professional series, and this might be maybe 10 years old, so I'd say let's take that home. There's a saw up here on that pile, but I'm afraid that's a little too far gone. Here on these shelves, the scrapyard owner sometimes puts things that he deemed too good to be thrown away. And this is a post vise or blacksmith's vise, and we're going to restore that today. And this looks like an old shredder or some kind of farming equipment, and I'm pretty sure it's 100 years old or more, but I really do not have a use for that. And down here in the dirt, an old wood chisel. And this is just one, but I recently obtained way more of those, and we're going to restore some of them in this video. Looks like someone dumped their motorcycle up on there, but yeah, I don't even have a license for those. And I also found this little wrench here made by Stahlwille, and this is where we're going to start today. So I'd say let's head over to the workshop then. This is really an easy fix. It's just a little rusty. I used the wire wheel and the angle grinder, and then I used this wire brush with a drill press to get into the nooks and crannies. Then I apply some oil, and there you have a really beautiful old wrench. The name of the company is pronounced Stahlwille. Stahl, that's German for steel, and Wille is both the German name for will, as in willpower, as well as the last name of the founder of the company. It's a play on words and would mean as much as will of steel. The company is located in Wuppertal, and a wrench like this would cost you around 25 euros. Let's get to the first really demanding project of the day then, the post vise. In German, Schmiedeschraubstock, blacksmith's vise. This is the third time that I'm restoring one of these. For some reason I keep finding them, and I won't stop buying them. Why? Well, for one, they are great tools, and secondly, they are true pieces of history. I'm sure that this one was built before World War II, and maybe it's even 100 years old. I don't really need more than 2 good vises here at the shop, but I also help building other workshops for my friends, and that's why I have a reason to buy the same thing a number of times. These restoration projects are always different though, and this one will be the most challenging of my 3 attempts at post-vise restoration, and this will be a very demanding job. There are welding beads all over the vise, because someone has used the vise to strike beads while stick welding. Some parts that are supposed to be movable have been welded together, and rather amateurishly at that. All that will have to be undone. The steel plate that is supposed to fasten the vise to a workbench surface is totally bent out of shape, and it will have to be heated up in the coal forge and straightened out on the anvil. Since the anvil is not ready for use, we will also build an Anvil Stand in this episode. And I start by disassembling the vise into all its individual parts before I can proceed to remove rust, dirt and paint. After applying some WD-40, the main screw and handle are removed. Then this bolt is unscrewed that holds the front jaw in place. I'm using the miner's wrench that AVE had given me as a gift a few years ago. Some people will tell me not to use adjustable wrenches, but I simply don't have wrenches this size. And using a piece of wood, I punch the old bolt out of that hole. Next, the bent mounting plate is also unscrewed. As luck would have it, the old nuts actually move quite willingly. Held by that plate is this spring. It comes loose with the plate. Now I break off this piece of steel that has been welded to the vise at some point. It is only the first step in removing another man's former add-ons to this historic tool. And in a move that I have performed once before, one post vise is used to work on a second one. Now I start removing rust and old paint with a wire wheel and the big angle grinder. What you can rarely see in the videos is that I usually wear a lot of safety equipment, in this case a dust mask, ear protection and a face shield. And let me tell you that a good face shield is worth every penny. Now the threads on the screw are cleaned. I do that with brake cleaner, a small wire brush and an ordinary piece of wire. And with most of the rust and paint gone, I can now start to undo the welding work on the vise. Pieces of steel have been attached to the vise in several places. Someone has welded the screw box to the fixed arm of the vise, and he inserted a piece of steel between box and arm. We will cut this loose with an angle grinder. On the jaws, anvil and other spots we can find small weld beads from stick welding. I start by cutting off some of the welds from the back side of the movable arm, and the surface is ground back into shape. The jaws are ground clean again as well. This piece of steel is first wiggled off and then ground down, and I begin to cut through the seam holding that steel part to the fixed arm. And I'm trying to only cut away the steel, trying not to touch the original cast of the vise. Now I move the part back and forth until the seam gives. And this worked pretty well. I removed less than a millimeter of material from the arm itself. And now the same thing happens to free the cast iron screw box from that bent steel part. And I succeeded to cut right through the weld seam. Now the remnants of that weld have to be ground off. Note that I always change wheels between cutting and grinding. Especially those really thin cut-off wheels should not be used for grinding. Now it was time to clean the screw box. And here I did something that I first learned over at Keith Fenner's channel. Fire can be used to clean cast from grime and old grease. Putting steel into a wood fire wouldn't be a good idea, as it would make it brittle, but I think the cast should be able to handle it. After cooling down, I'm using this small wire brush with the drill press to clean the threads inside. And this is what the part looks like after having been oiled. The smaller parts, like the nuts and spring, are cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner to remove greasy dirt before sandblasting is used to remove the rust. And I really need a blasting cabinet. I'm wasting a ton of media even on those smaller parts. Moving on to that mounting plate. It really is bent out of shape. But before working on it in the forge, I want to remove paint rust, welds and that piece of steel. The weld is again cut. Then that piece of stock is pried off and a lengthy process of grinding down all the weld buildup begins. For those of you who are maybe not yet into stick welding, this happens when you use a vise to hold workpieces that you intend to stick weld on. In order to get the electrode working, you strike it against one of the metal surfaces connected to the minus pole of the welder. In order to spare the workpiece, it is often done by striking the vise. Do this many times and you can add piles of steel to a part, being several centimeters thick. With everything ground down, the plate is ready for the forge. But the anvil needs a new anvil stand before we can do that, so let's finish that first. I had already cut these old wooden beams to length with a table saw some months ago. They've been waiting to be turned into an anvil stand ever since. I used 2 tension belts and a mallet to get the wooden block into the rough shape that I want to have it in the end. Instead of these straps, bands made from steel will hold the stand together then. So I take 2 roughly 2 meter long stock parts of flat steel. Measurements are taken and a 10mm hole is drilled close to one end of the steel. I also mark various spots on the steel and use the punch mark in order to make those spots more visible. Now the oxyacetylene torch is fired up. In an intermediate step, I check if our steel band really fits around the block. And now that I am sure that it will fit, I drill a hole close to the other end of the steel. The 2 ends of the steel are not supposed to meet in the end, but there should be about a 4 centimeter air gap between them so that I can use a bolt to put tension on the belt. And here I fasten it temporarily to check if it really makes a tight fit. Then the process is repeated and the 2 bands are installed. The idea behind this kind of anvil stand is that the parallel pieces of wood are still capable of some upward and downward movement so that they can adjust to indentations and irregularities in the ground beneath. Now I'm cutting out a piece from this roll of roofing felt that I found in the garden shack. Inserting it between the anvil and the stand will hopefully make the anvil much quieter when striking it with the hammer. And here's how I determined the correct height for the stand before I had cut the wood. Standing at the anvil, holding the hammer in a horizontal position with your arms straight. At least according to an old book about blacksmithing, this is how you determine the correct height. And now the forge is fired up. This is an old portable forge, in German called Feldesse, meaning field forge. Well, because it could be used in the field. I usually start with a small wood fire. And if the coal isn't perfectly dry, it can be quite hard to actually get the coal to burn properly. I got the forge from my father, who had bought it some 30 years ago, but had never used it. I first did this 16 years ago, but especially the firing up of the coal has never lost its magic for me. And the mounting plate is placed into the fire. This is all about making the right moves and hitting the right spot in a short period of time and keeping a close eye on not overshooting while straightening this piece. This plastic bucket here is way too small and absolutely not suited for quenching steel, but I didn't have anything else at hand here. There is still a lot of room for improvement concerning the setup of the forge. After forging, the plate is wire wheeled once again. Some of the other parts of the vise have received a heat treatment to return the freshly ground off surfaces to the blackish color of the cast. Everything is oiled. For that I use ballastol for rust protection. The fixed arm is temporarily fastened to the workbench and the spring is inserted. grease is applied to the screw and the spindle is reattached, and I can screw it in with no effort at all. Let's have a go at that Bosch angle grinder then. I would estimate that this tool was made in the 2000s, and while Bosch still makes some really good tools, there can be no argument that my older Bosch angle grinder that I use all the time in my videos is of superior quality to this one. It also looks really beaten up, and one of the little doors giving you access to the motor brushes is broken. Someone probably tried to pry it open. I now remove the handle and try to take a look at the brushes, but the plastic parts holding the brushes have melted and they are stuck to the enclosure. It looks like there has been a fire. Upon pulling off the stator pack, we can look at the rudder of this universal motor directly. We can see that the turns have melted and are completely destroyed. This is a case where even I have to say that this is beyond reasonable repair. Well, but at least we can salvage the guard and some other replacement parts, like the switch, which often breaks in these angle grinders, from this machine and use it for future repairs. Let's get to the wood chisel then that we found at one of the scrapyards. And I start by simply removing some rust with WD-40 and some abrasive fabric. I have a special connection to these tools because my dad is a wood carver by trade and has been using carving tools for over 40 years. Since he had a workshop at our house, I basically grew up with these things. And when I moved into my new shop earlier this year, I actually found a huge assortment of woodworking tools that once belonged to the landlord who passed away last year. Let's have a good time then here, remove some rust and check out some of the historic details. These carving tools here are from around the 1970s, I guess, but these tools are certainly much older. They need new handles and a lot of rust needs to be removed. And I found some older handles that seem to fit. Now let's see if we can find some information about the manufacturers of these tools. These tools here were made by a company called Spannsäge. What's that? Well, that's a buck saw. And at that time it was practice that every company put a punch mark in their chisels. So here on the blade you can find a buck saw punch. Maybe you have heard of Kirschen or cherry wood chisels, as you can buy them here in this home improvement store. Well, that company bought Spannsäge a while ago and they are really similar. This tool has a weather vane and that would be a company called Wolferts und Everts. Dörken und Birkenbeil. This chisel shows a little X. I have nothing. This chisel says JDS and L and shows a hacksaw. This one a crescent moon. On the other side the word frère, is that French? Maybe it's a French chisel? This massive chisel seems to read the word Köln, but spelled with a C. The name of my city before 1919, which would make this at least 100 years old. And if you know anything about these punch marks or the names of the companies, then please leave a comment below. But are these tools still any good? Well guys, I hope you liked this video, and if yes, please give it a like so that I know to go ahead and produce more of it. And for those of you who are more into electronics and into metalworking, don't worry, it'll always be a mixture around here. If you want to support me actively in making new videos, please visit my Patreon page and become a supporter. See you soon.